Welcome to Dwell on These Things, a podcast of Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio, where we discuss whatever is honorable, pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, and praiseworthy.
Well, welcome to the Dwell on These Things podcast. I'm Chris, one of the teachers here, and I've got the privilege of being able to sit down with Joe Botti today, who has been an awesome influence in our church for many years, a man who's worn a whole bunch of different hats in our church over the years, and just a really admirable leader. I think you've got quite a bit of experience and stories and things that might be really interesting to a lot of us to share. So why don't we start with that? Thanks for coming here, Joe.
No problem. Thanks for the generous introduction.
Yeah, well, I it's not enough, honestly. I wish I could say more.
Don't know about that.
You've got an interesting history of nicknames, a handful that I've heard, probably a lot I haven't heard, too. Tell me about some of those nicknames you've got.
Well, I had one growing up. It was Little Joe because my next door neighbor was Big Joe. He was older and much bigger, and so our families used to get confused when people were calling for Joe. We didn't know which one they were calling for, so we named him Big Joe and me Little Joe, and then that got shortened to Little, and then that got shortened to Lit. So a lot of my family members call me Lit.
They call you Lit.
Lit. And
so
then,
it went from, your mom calling out the back door, Little Joe.
Yeah.
And it's just easier to say Lit.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good.
So, and then some call me Bobo or Boo Boo. Dennis McCallum likes to call me Boo Boo.
Yep.
And
where'd that come from?
I don't have no idea.
Yeah, as with so many of his nicknames.
Yeah.
Difficult to tell.
And then John
But
Ross calls me Giovanni or Giovanni, like the yogurt.
Yeah.
So whatever. Those are some nicknames.
Giovanni. That's a good one. There's another one I heard. Maybe you're trying to forget this one. Bubonic.
Oh, that was Phil Frank. Bubonic plague. So.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
That's good. Those are good nicknames. I've found that giving people nicknames becomes a term of endearment. And so people with lots of nicknames are usually people that are well-loved. And I've had a couple nicknames, but nothing as awesome as what you've had.
I would love to hear those names sometime.
Well, maybe we can do a podcast about that sometime in the future.
Nice.
So, one of the things I think that people are interested in our church, and something I know I'm interested in, is hearing about how people came to know the Lord, their personal testimony. And I'd love to hear yours. I'd love to hear how you came to know the Lord. Well,
I came to know the Lord in my college years. A friend was pretty persistent in inviting me out to a home Bible study, and it took him a while to get me out. Always had a lot of excuses. But after about 6 months of him inviting me out, I finally came out to a Bible study, and I was surprised because I really liked it and thought it was really interesting. It was a home Bible study group that met down someone's basement.
That's cool.
After about 6 months, I decided to receive Christ after 6 months of going to that Bible study. I had grown up in a mainline denominational church and always believed in Jesus. I really appreciated the stories I heard about Jesus.
Yeah.
And definitely wanted to be with him and definitely wanted to do right by him, but I wasn't quite sure on how I was supposed to do that or how I was supposed to get in there with him and get to heaven one day after I died, and interpreted the church as teaching that it was by good works that you gain eternal life. So if your good works outweigh your bad works, then if you're lucky, you might get eternal life, and if you're good enough, you might get there. And that was always a nagging question for me was, well, how good is good enough? And if I have a bad day, and
how do you make up for that?
How do I make up for that?
Sure.
So when I heard the gospel message that being right with God was just a matter of faith, a gift from God, if you have faith alone, then that's enough to get you in there with God and get you forgiven. Well, I realized back then that was a different message than I'd been hearing.
Yeah.
And so after I heard that message, I spent several months looking into it in the Bible, looking at verses to see if these things were so. I just couldn't believe that it was so easy to come to Christ through faith and faith alone, apart from good works. So eventually, after a few months, like I said, then I asked a few brothers at the Bible study if they'd pray with me just so I could kind of affirm my faith.
Yeah.
And that was a big relief after that. I had a lot more peace after that.
How old were you about that time?
I was 21.
21. Yeah, I was around 21 too when I decided to follow Christ.
Yeah.
It's a good story. I think a lot of young people are faced with these kinds of questions of what matters and what's my place in all of it. And to have experienced coming to know the Lord at that time, and then to hear your story as well, it's something that I think a lot of young people need to hear.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us.
Sure.
Now, the years go by from there. You are walking with God, and you've worn a number of different hats, both as an employee and as a volunteer in our church. Tell us about some of those.
I guess initially, after I really got going with the Lord, a few years later, I started leading in a home church, in a young adult home church, with a good friend, Martha McCallum. And so that was really good experience. And then after a few years, our home church grew enough to the point where we could plant off a new group. And so I had just gotten married about that time, so my wife and I got to senior lead a home church with some other folks.
What year was this?
That was 1986.
Okay.
I believe. Yeah, 1986.
I was a little babe.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that. And then I actually got involved with the junior high ministry in 1989.
Okay.
And as a volunteer.
Yeah.
It was a fledgling ministry at that time, just started and, a bit vulnerable. And some really cool people were trying their hand at junior high ministry, like the Merkers, and I think maybe Sharon Watkins.
Okay.
And a few others. But they needed more people to help. There was about 30 kids involved. And so they needed a few more volunteers. So at the time, my wife was pregnant with our first child, and she was teaching middle school at public and private middle schools. So she was teaching middle school language arts. And she was kind of bummed that she wanted to stay at home and raise kids. And, that was all good with her. She was great with that, wanted to do that. But she was also at the same time going to miss being with middle school kids. Yeah. So someone suggested, I think it was KJ Swearingen suggested, that we get involved in the junior high ministry to help, I guess, fulfill that missing piece or that missing part for Cindy.
Yeah.
And it took me a lot longer to warm up to that idea. Cindy was into it right away. But I was like, do I really want to hang out with junior high kids?
Sure. Yeah.
And after several weeks of thinking and praying about it, I got involved in that, and that was 1989.
Wow.
And it actually took me probably, I would say, another couple years to get comfortable after I joined the ministry, to get comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And feel like it was a good fit.
So you're into the 90s at this point, serving in junior high ministry.
Yeah.
How many nights a week were you out doing this kind of ministry?
Junior high at that time was their bigger meeting, which was, 30 or 40 kids at the time.
Okay.
And that was on Sunday night. It was called the Blowout. And then we had an every other week boys or girls cell group. So it was just 1.5 times a week.
And you're doing this in addition to your own home church.
Yeah, that's right.
And you've got a child at home.
Yeah.
How did you and your wife manage that?
It was good because we had Dave and Tracy Glover were also leading with us at the time, home church.
Okay.
And they started to take more of the load with the adult home church that we were in. That was a big help.
Yeah. Real blessing.
Yeah. But then our good friends, the Glovers and Stephen and Marilyn Bauer, ended up getting involved in the junior high ministry too, about that same time, a few years after we did.
Wow.
Maybe a year after we did. So they were big players in the junior high. And so one of the best parts was getting to do that ministry with friends.
Yeah. I have little doubt that some of that was probably them looking at your life and your wife and seeing how much it affected you, how much you loved it and how valuable it was. And it was infectious. They wanted a part of that.
That may be, and I think that's very generous. I know that one of the refrains was, we have to rebuild our youth.
Yeah.
We felt like this was a really good strategic use of our time. Of course, it was a lot of fun, and just building into those kids was a blast.
Now, in the timeline of our church's history, you've got the people that came into our church and our church growing through the 70s, through the 80s. Those people went on to have children, and this was that generation that you were working with, those children.
Yeah.
Those children now are leading in both student and adult ministry, many in adult ministry, I'm sure.
That's right, yeah, because now those kids who were in middle school, a lot of them are leading adult home churches.
Sure. Yeah.
They're 40 years old at this point.
Yeah. Wow. So in some ways, you guys were having an impact on multiple generations. Now a generation who's leading in our church, who have their own children. Some of them may be doing middle school ministry with their kids now.
Yeah, I know a lot of them are.
Wow. That is really cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So another one of the things that you were able to do that turned out to be precedent setting. You were behind a lot of the camps and programs and stuff that we do with kids in junior high and getting a lot of those things started, getting those things going. And we've seen decades now of students and young people being affected by those camps, and you were at the forefront of a lot of that. Tell us about some of that.
Rewinding back to 1990, after I was in junior high about a year, a sphere leader suggested that our junior high does a camp like other churches do.
Summer camp.
A summer camp, an overnight summer camp. And so at that point, I think I was probably heading up the junior high at that point, maybe in late 1990 maybe.
Okay.
And so sphere leader asked me, what do you think about doing a camp? And I was just like, wow, I don't know. I was not on staff at that point.
Okay.
And I was still working at my other job, and I just was like, I don't know if I can pull that off because that's going to be a lot of work. Sure, there's only 35 kids, but
it's a summer camp.
It's a summer camp.
Yeah,
it's overnight.
It's right.
And, you have to have a lot of organization. However, I had spent 5 summers working at this summer camp in college called Recreation Unlimited. It was a camp for the mentally and physically handicapped.
Okay.
And it was an overnight camp. They did it on the north end of town. My friend Dan O'Brien had convinced me that I really should be a counselor for this camp and join him as he was going to be a counselor for this camp.
Yeah.
And so I reluctantly agreed to be a counselor at this camp, and I did it for 2 weeks that summer, and it was the most tiring, exhausting experience I ever had, but it was also the most rewarding experience I ever had.
Awesome.
I mean, we were going around, the camp was at Camp Ohio, and we're wheeling all these folks around in their wheelchairs, helping them in and out of the bathroom, helping them into bed. I got home, and I think I slept for 2 days.
I believe it.
And so then I proceeded to work at that camp for a week or two every summer for the next 3 or 4 years.
Wow. So you went back.
Yeah, I went back.
Multiple
years to do that camp because it was so awesome.
Yeah.
I saw how that camp just changed those handicapped folks.
Yeah.
And really enjoyed it. So when the question was posed, do you want to do a summer camp for middle school kids? I thought, let me go ahead and talk to those directors of that camp, Recreation Unlimited, just to get some ideas. And so I met with them a couple times. They gave me ideas, and I came back and told the sphere leaders, I'll do it.
Wow. And that was in late 90, you said?
Yeah, it was in late 90, and so our first camp was in 1991.
Wow.
We had 37 kids. It was 5 nights, and it was a blast. It was really good.
That's great. That's awesome.
And at the end of the camp, I was with Dan Pettit, who's in our church, and he was also a volunteer there, and we just couldn't believe we pulled it off.
That's awesome. And then you continued to lead that up for how many years into the future?
20-some years in the future.
20-some years.
Yeah.
Wow. That's awesome. That's really cool to think about how many students have been affected by that, who've heard the gospel.
It was good. God was good to us.
That's awesome.
A lot of kids came to Christ. It was cool.
Any kids from that time you're friends with today that you think back on with fond memories that were kind of crazy and wild in those days?
Oh, boy.
Anyone we can throw under the bus who might be listening?
Boy, a lot of good memories. I remember this wasn't necessarily from camp. This was from, we used to take mission trips with our junior high kids.
Okay.
We'd go up to Michigan and run a soccer camp for low-income families. Our kids from our youth group would camp, and then we would travel and pick up the kids who were going to the soccer camp and put on a soccer camp. And it was a blast. But it was really good for unity, and I remember just the practical jokes we used to pull on our own kids at those camps. I think one time I faked like I got my thumb chopped off, and we were going to the emergency.
with the ketchup in the blood?
With ketchup in the blood. And,
oh, that's great.
And so we took off into the cars like, oh, we got to get Joe to the hospital. And then
the kids are freaking out.
Kids are freaking out. And including one of my own children was a participant in that camp.
Wow.
And so decided we better turn around. So after a couple hundred yards, we turned the car around and had to fess up that we were just joking. Oh, man, I got so much flack for that.
That's good. It's those shared experiences, those shared memories. Those are the things you remember. Those are the things that impact people. And, it's a mixture of having fun, but also having spiritual conversations. And it's real. There's something authentic to that. And getting away from town for a little bit, with a group of people to do those kinds of things it's clearly had an impact on so many.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, let's talk about your role as an employee at Dwell. We've already talked about your history doing a lot of volunteer work and then coming on as a staff member. When did the switch happen to when you became a full-time employee here at the church?
That was probably in 1992, I think. Actually, Xenos was paying me a day or two a week to lead the junior high program because I just wasn't able to pull off that and my other job. I guess after a couple years of doing that with the junior high, the fellowship decided that they were going to get some infrastructure built into the church because it was kind of unorganized. And the elders were having to make a lot of decisions, small decisions that they would rather not have had to wade into.
Distracting
decisions.
Sure.
And it was kind of like the Acts chapter 6 where the apostles picked deacons to feed the widows. So they decided that they would try to put in some more infrastructure. It was a big budget increase, too, and they would hire 5 division coordinators who could manage each of the 5 divisions. And so at that point, they gave me a call to see if I would like to manage the evangelism division.
Interesting.
And that division at that time included the adult central teachings, the adult outreach groups. It included missions.
Wow.
It included all the youth ministry.
No kidding.
So it was a lot, but everything was so much smaller then. So it was
so
still
essentially
doable.
You were managing the entire church in different ways.
Well, not quite. There was 4 other divisions. There was the operations division, the equipping division, and the pastoral division.
So you were there right at the forefront of when these divisions started, and you took on the evangelism division at that time.
That's right.
So what happened next?
Well, I definitely felt over my head and think I was over my head. But again, I think, God was with it and it worked out. So a few years later, we had a consultant come in, a management church consultant, to see if our organization was working properly, if we were being efficient. And they came in and reorganized a lot of different things about the infrastructure.
Okay.
Or at least suggested changes to make. So we took a lot of those suggestions, and at that point, it was probably in the mid-90s, maybe 96 or 97, that we then broke student ministries off as its separate division. And then we put Calumet into the student ministry division at that point. It was sitting in pastoral.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So then my job became more streamlined.
So did you move at that point from overseeing a lot of the adult administration to now overseeing a lot of the student administration?
That's correct.
Okay. So at that point, did the division title change?
It was just division coordinator of student ministries instead of division coordinator of evangelism.
And then you did that for many years.
Yeah. From that time until just a month or two ago.
Wow. That's quite a history. That division in particular has been a large part of my whole time here in this church. I've been able to work with you, for a handful of years now. You've always done an excellent job, able to navigate things really well and organize things really well. You're a highly gifted administrator. And yet, you're able to go through that without getting bogged down in bureaucracy or, not getting caught up in that impersonal, legalistic letter of the law type things. You maintain a personal touch while being able to manage this high level of administration. Another aspect of this, Joe, that is so endearing about you is that you have a knack for finding the right person for the right job. And recently, last couple months, you've successfully replaced yourself as department head with an awesome successor, Brian Adams. That is not an easy thing to do, to be able to train up a successor for a very important job in our church. How have you learned to recognize godly and talented people for these kinds of roles?
I don't know. Again, I think God's been really good. I definitely know that if I try to hire someone for an important role and I don't get God involved, then it's probably not going to be a good outcome. I really don't trust myself. So I actually got some good tools from Dave Glover. He's another division, as you know, division coordinator of missions, but he gave me this hiring tool that helps figure out in the best way possible, trying to be as objective as possible, just a good hiring tool. So I use that and definitely praying a lot about it.
So prayer becomes an important thing, even in the midst of finding somebody for these kinds of things.
That's right.
Well, you've done a wonderful job of that over the years, and a lot of the people that you've hired, and it's clear that God has brought those people here and put them in these roles, and your willingness to listen to Him and to go to Him and to use your own mind, and that combination of God working through people is pretty amazing.
Yeah, thanks. It's great.
That's cool.
I'm really glad that Brian Adams is the man now, the coordinator for student, because I think he's just good timing.
Yep.
He's the right man for the job.
Totally agree. Brian's amazing.
Yeah, he's amazing. He was able to shadow me for over a year in my role and follow me around, and we would discuss and make decisions together. And he was with me on a few of those hires.
Yeah. So you mentored him through these years.
Yeah, there's some mentoring, and he's been an eager learner and a fast learner, and he also gets about twice as much done as I do in half the time. So I think it's a good time for transition over to him. So
that's awesome. That's great. Yeah, I love working with Brian, and you've done a great job there finding the right man for that job. So let's move on to talk about some of your family history, as a father. And, I mentioned before, you have 3 children. All 3 of your children now into adulthood are walking with the Lord. What kind of lessons have you learned? I know as a young father myself, I am so eager to sponge up any sort of wisdom or any kind of lesson or experience when it comes to raising my family. I'm sure there are a lot of young parents who could benefit from some of your wisdom on that. What kind of lessons have you learned as a father raising your children?
Well, I've learned that children are pretty forgiving, all the mistakes you make as a parent, all the mistakes I made as a parent. So they tend to be pretty forgiving, and also I think pretty resilient too, which I think is cool.
Resilient in the sense of being able to go through a lot and come out on top, that kind of thing?
I think so, and they can get past the mistakes you make. Even when the kids are little, we're so afraid of making mistakes when our kids are little.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And we do make mistakes, and we will make mistakes. And it's not going to kill them. I mean, they'll be okay. I think one of the big lessons that I wish I had learned earlier is that God is bigger than our mistakes. And yes, we want to minimize those mistakes as much as possible. But God's also involved, so He wants our kids to walk with Him. And He's doing whatever He can inside of free will to make good things happen.
Yeah.
I'm also a firm believer in the scripture that says love covers a multitude of your sins.
No kidding.
One of the things that I learned early on as a parent from Dennis and Holly and Gary and Bev DeLashmet was that to build a relationship with your kids. And so get that weekly date with each one of your kids. Definitely get your family time, get your family dinners in several times a week, but also get that one-on-one time with each of your kids. So I saw them do that, and I marked that before we had kids, that, you know what, I'm going to do the same thing. And I think that's been super helpful, and we were able to carry that tradition on for a long time. We received a lot of help from our youth group leaders. So our kids were all in the youth group here at Dwell, and thank God we had good youth group leaders who are watching over our kids and help mentoring them. You just can't do it alone as a parent, so...
Yeah, and that's a difficult thing to give up, that control over. You've raised your kids from infancy, into toddlers, and then they start getting to school age, and it gets to the point where, okay, now they're middle school aged and so forth, and older, where they're becoming their own people and they need to make their own decisions. You're still their parent, you're still helping them, but now these other people are coming into their lives, these other mentoring, discipleship, godly roles, these spiritual relationships. And to be willing to trust that God's going to do something there is not an easy thing.
I think it can be. You speak of a really good transition for parenting. When your kids go from 9, 10 years old, and then they start changing and start giving you a little bit of back talk.
Those weird changing years.
They go through adolescence, and you don't know how to parent anymore, and according to them. And as a parent, you are in no man's land. And so it's really difficult to make that transition as a parent from high control to less control and giving them more independence and slowly letting out that leash.
Yeah.
So I was actually kind of glad to have some other youth group leaders involved because they definitely get more help. They had influence. Yes, I still had a lot of influence, but it was really nice to get godly influences backing me.
Especially when the kids are saying, I've heard enough from Dad. I want to hear from somebody else. And here God has put some new person in their life who's following the Lord, and they can now take that on in their own unique way.
Yeah, they're in college, so they're cool.
Yeah, right.
And so they'll listen to them.
Wow. I haven't gotten there yet. I know it's coming. It's right around the corner for me, and something that terrifies me a bit. But seeing the way you've done that and others gives me a lot of hope that God is at work. He's doing something. And, knowing your son, for example, knowing how well adjusted he is, how well he's turned out. And yeah, it's amazing. There's so much chaos, especially as a young parent, that you're going through. And the idea that one day my kid's going to be out on their own or they're going to be doing this is just, even more confusing.
Yeah, I think today it's so difficult to raise kids. They've got so many things coming at them.
Yep.
And to have an advocate in the church who has influence, who is seen as cool, good influence.
Right.
I just don't know how you would do it otherwise. And so I think that was super helpful.
Yeah.
I think, too, for me, I tend to be negative and perfectionistic, and I thrust some of that on my kids, which, looking back, I think, oh, man, I wish I wasn't as much like that.
How they get through that.
How they get through that. But where I think it's important to have, and what I didn't have as much of, I wish I would have had more, is vision. So having a strong vision for each of your kids, trying to discern, what things are they good at, what things might God be pointing out that they might have gifting in, and then trying to build on those strengths. Now, that doesn't mean you can't address weaknesses that your kids have,
Sure.
But when you do, it's in the context of that larger vision, and I think that's super helpful.
What kind of things would you do to try and develop a vision like that for your kids?
Well, I think for Michelle, our oldest, for some reason, she was really good with talking with people that she hadn't met before. And somehow in middle and high school, she learned the art of talking to new people who would come to the group and just making them feel welcome. I think she has a lot of empathy. And I think she would put herself in the place of a new person.
Imagine what it would be like.
Yeah, and so she would just
Meeting a
go
new
right
group.
up and talk to them and welcome them. Really, really hospitable. And so, you try to build on that.
Yeah.
I think she was hospitable as when she would have her little friends over when she was a little kid.
Yeah.
And so just trying to build on that and think, okay, how could God use this gift of hospitality? And, pray it through with God, try to get some ideas.
Yeah.
And then try to build on that. And then when the negatives come up, maybe try to show how that negative is going to take away from the positive things, that positive vision that God has for them.
I remember this was a number of years ago. I was asking you some questions about parenting. This was must have been right around the time either my first was born or my second. They were both born within a year of each other, so it was kind of a quick time to learn.
That is a quick turnaround.
Yeah, it was. But struggling with this question of how do I help communicate to my kids their need for Christ? And I remember you shared with me that as your children, when they're little, they're making mistakes, they're not listening, they're disobeying, they're whatever it is they're doing that's wrong. Giving godly, loving discipline to your children, disciplining them, but also taking that opportunity in the midst to share, and this is why we need forgiveness from Jesus. That's something that I've used with my children ever since they were old enough to hear and understand, and that's something that's had a real impact on my family just hearing you say that. And so it's interesting to think about, you're noticing the unique ways that the Lord has made your children different, and they're their own individuals, but you're coming alongside with that uniqueness that God has made and trying to support it and encouraging it. And that sounds like a really good decision in being a godly parent. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I wish I had done more of it, but
There are so many children in our fellowship from this next generation who are raising their families, and they want to raise spiritually minded children. Can you think of any dangers that you notice young married couples might be faced with today that might be important to work through early on in marriage? Anything there?
one danger that I see is a lot of young couples getting married and they're dual income, no kids, of course. So they're making a lot of money and their expenses aren't very high. And what I've seen in some cases is where young couples like this get into a situation where they have the money, so they buy an expensive house, not really looking down the road for when they have children and their expenses are going to increase. They have two incomes now, so why not? We can afford it, and they've got the banker telling them they can afford the mortgage.
Sure, of course.
And they need to have more foresight to see that, hey, we're going to have kids, we're going to have more expensive, and we're going to want to have mom or dad spend a lot more time at home.
Right.
Maybe not work at all, or maybe just work part-time. And so
be with the kids rather than being stuck at the job because you've got yourself backed into a corner where you need to pay those bills.
that's right.
Yeah.
I've seen some couples get into that, kind of backed into a corner to now where they both have to work full-time just to pay the bills.
Right.
And meanwhile, kids don't get the attention from their parents that they really need.
Yeah.
And studies show kids need parental attention, and a lot of it.
Yeah, they sure do. And I think the way of our world has been moving for many years in a direction away from that, the attention that maybe the kids deserve and require from the parents. That's a difficult thing. I'm thinking about my own family, and my wife works part-time. I've got a uniquely flexible job. But that time that we get with our kids in the morning all the way up through, toddlerhood and then school age starts and it's gone.
And there's nothing that can beat that.
Nothing.
Nothing can beat it, and then it's over.
It's over, and then, you have that time, before they're getting into middle school and high school, and then that time's over. And before you know it, I could see myself sitting, 10 years down the road, looking back on a decade with my children that wasn't spent with my children. That brings me to tears thinking about that. That's a really good danger that's right at the forefront of our generation. I think that parents would do well to consider those things in that warning. Well, I think that's good. I figured we could kind of end this session by talking about maybe some advice that you could give from your experience. You've always made yourself available to God's leading. What's helped prepare you to take those steps?
Well, I would say the first thing was making that decision when I was 24, 25 years old. This was after I was a Christian, after, I had salvation by faith. A few years after that, I made that decision to give my whole life to Christ.
Right.
And I think that was the starting place to be used by God. And I would just say that make yourself available to God, because it's more about availability than it is about ability. And
wise words.
I feel like I'm just average at best. But if I can make myself available to God, He can do incredible things through it. Right. He took Moses' rod and parted the Red Sea with it. So if He can do that with Moses' rod, then He can probably do that with me.
Right.
Availability versus ability.
I've mentioned a number of times here your humility and how awesome that is to know you as a humble servant of Christ. And I know you would not say that about yourself. That's what true humility is.
There's a lot of arrogance going on in my head that I never talk about. You wouldn't dare say.
Well, we'll leave those things in your head, Joe.
Good.
But part of your humility is that faithfulness to God that you have, and whatever it is He set out before you, the work over many years of service. What have you learned about our call from God to faithfulness as stewards of what we've been entrusted with?
Well, that's a good question. God has certainly entrusted us with different things at different times in our lives. I think sometimes we might feel like, well, He's not entrusted me with very much. Mm-hmm. And yet He has. You just look in front of you. What has He entrusted you with? And are you faithful with that?
Right.
Be faithful for what God has given you right now at this time. And, if you're faithful in a few things, God will make you faithful over in a lot of things.
Right.
I think that's a key truth that I remind myself of. And sometimes we don't feel like we're getting the results we should get. We input X amount and we expect, well, because I input X amount, I'm going to get Y amount in return. And that's just not necessarily the way it works.
Right.
And so God's trying to teach us to be faithful, even if the results aren't apparent.
Yeah.
Continue to be faithful with what I've given you.
Yeah.
And at the end, we've got a crown awaiting us
Right.
and words from Christ,
Yeah.
who says, well done, good and faithful servant. So,
Right. Yeah, and that wrapped up in that is that desire to be found by God, trustworthy as a servant. If we're into following God, that's something that becomes pretty important.
yeah. If I get to the end, when I get to the end, and if Christ says, well done, good and faithful servant, that's all I need.
That'll make it all worth it.
Yeah. Heck
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree. That's awesome. Well, Joe, I really appreciate you joining us here today. Thanks for all the insight you've passed on to us. It's been really awesome to hear it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, if you guys are interested in checking out anything more about our church, you can go to dwellcc.org, where we have listings of our teachings and other essays and articles, information about our church. And as always, we've got this podcast. You can follow that as well. Thanks for giving us some of your time.